Welcome to Podcasters Row. This is King of Podcasts here with you. Appreciate all of you joining us here to the program. Wherever you find the program, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, iHeartRadio, all other places. And of course, it all emanates from kingofpodcasts.com. And thank you again for joining us. Great guests that we have here on the program today. I'm glad we're finally getting ourselves back into the mix of getting the show back up because, you know, it's been a little while since I got a chance to go and get just the momentum back up to get more guests to go on board, because really it's all about those of you that are podcasters listening to the program or those that you know of that have a podcast. Tell them to go ahead and follow me over here. Go to kingofpodcasts.com and just go ahead and find a way to contact me. You can contact me directly through kingofpodcasts@yahoo.com. Go right there, send a request, and we'd love to go and have you on, because really this is just a matter of a little cross promotion, a little bit of time to talk to other podcasters, learn about their craft, and learn what they're talking about. And for today's program, I want to welcome a team of podcasters. They have a combined of decades of caregiving experience, and also one of our guests having an extensive background in the software industry. They are navigating multiple caregiving roles while maintaining careers to provide support and resources to caregivers. And the aim of the Caregivers Journey podcast is to help caregivers move from feeling frightened to confident through candid conversations and actionable steps. And they've created the podcast, The Caregivers Journey, to fill a specific gap and existing caregiver support with their podcast and other offerings. So I want to welcome the co-founders and the co-hosts of the Caregivers Journey, Nancy, Treaster, and Sue Ryan. Thank you both for being on with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it as well.
We're glad to be here.
I've had much time to go and talk off air about myself, or just to get a chance to get acquainted. But I'll tell you, just for context, I live in South Florida. More than enough know that I have family that's in the healthcare community, that we are more familiar with the process of it, you know, for people that were looking for certified nurses aides, home health aides, and the caregivers, and also knowing that I've had family members we've had to go and take care of. Because in my household, you know, taking care of my father right now, he's 80 years old. We had all my grandparents came through here. I'm from a family humid household, right? So it's like we're not sending anybody in assisted living, anything like that. So the understanding of what the healthcare market is here, and knowing if you're trying to bring somebody as a personal caregiver to keep someone out of an assisted living facility, to still be able to go and live at home and still function at home to some capacity with help. Real quickly, I'll just leave it to both of you about what it really comes down to. That said, with your decades of experience in caregiving, what you do in terms of specifically what kind of patients are the ones that are most needed for this kind of healthcare, this personal caregiving, and what you focus on the most.
So you want to start?
When we look at caregivers and we look at the care receivers, the combination of that is our loved ones. When we're looking at the diagnosis that they have, our primary focus, because of our experience, is with care receivers who have different diagnoses of dementia. And when we look at those who are going to be giving care for them, it is us who are, as you had identified, who are family members. And then we also complement that sometimes with professional help or with other kinds of help that come in through our family to be able to provide the care. What we're really focusing on making sure is that, of course, our loved one has the best level of care for where they are in their diagnosis. And what we want to make sure of, especially if we're supporting them as a family unit, is how we prepare each of our family members to be the best caregiver. And part of that gets to asking them what they're comfortable and not comfortable with in the area of care. And Nancy, I'm going to ask you to speak toward that from an experience you had. And then the other part of it is making sure that their home, and we have podcast episodes about this, but where they're living, the home they're living in, is actually safe and is actually re-architected to support what they have access to and what will keep them safe 24/7. So it's a blend of what those components are. And we've talked about home safety in some of our podcast episodes, and we've talked about wandering and things like that. And Nancy, we've actually talked about this in a podcast episode, but I think it your specific example of the level of care of the different family members based on what they're comfortable with would be a good response to his question.
So first, I think, as Sue said, we do focus on dementia family caregivers, and I would argue that that's one of, if not the hardest kind of caregiving for family members to have to deal with. And we keep our family members as home as long as we possibly can. It's a very demanding job for people living with dementia. Sue and I focus our podcast episodes really on the family caregiver, with the idea that across the world, there are lots of people who are first timers. They're not trained in dementia care. They're first time home caregivers. And there are some very specific things, although they're common day-to-day things on how to take care of someone with dementia, that we want to make sure they have resources to educate themselves with. So that's what our podcast is focused on. And that's the kind that we do we do 25-minute episodes. They're very tip oriented. We cover topics like bathing and dressing, incontinence, wandering, home safety, all the little personal care, grooming. How do you manage someone who's living with dementia through the phases of their journey? And I was fortunate enough to be able to keep both my husband and my father-in-law at home through the very end. But these are all lessons learned either by Sue or I, or through caregiver support groups that we've been in, where we've learned lessons, how to take away the keys, everything from the early stages and how to communicate to the late stages and how to change someone's depend if they're bedridden. So that's our objective. And it's really difficult to manage day-to-day home care for someone who's living with dementia through the entire journey, because it's a marathon, not a sprint.
The biggest
And
Nancy, go ahead, Sue. Go ahead.
No, Nancy, one of the things that you experienced that we talk about in our podcast that goes toward his question is what you and Merritt had the conversation about with when you are keeping your loved one at home and you've got family members and what levels of care each of them can provide.
So go ahead, George.
Well, I wanted to make the point that distinction between a patient who is bedridden and one that can still more or less.
Sure.
It's just, again, with dementia and Alzheimer's, my grandfather, I want to say it was 5 years, we had him at home with us. My parents were still both working. We were in college, and it was still 6 people in the house. And then we had, for a while, it was going to be somebody that came in that would check in from time to time. But then we had somebody that was living with us, and I just know that, for the bulk, the whole time he really, my grandfather just could not move out. He really was bedridden. We had a hospital bed brought into the bedroom here where he's at. And, she, at least the other thing was, I could say, is hard to find a caregiver that feels like she wants to envelop herself into the family, where she was cooking, she was cleaning, taking care of a lot of the household chores for us while taking care of my grandfather. But that's something that's so difficult for anyone to go and find now. And then at the same time, without going into too much detail, because I'll talk about my family, but for other family members, people I've worked with, where there was somebody that I'll say that she was going through, but prior to this, she was in her late 70s, completely, in great shape. First of all, it was very athletic, very health conscious, a lot behind that. And, moves around. It was just, you wouldn't have ever thought that she was dealing with anything with dementia and Alzheimer's. But yeah, the problem was that the caregiver for that, while she could move around the house, the patient, the caregiver was just not good and not prepared to go and handle when things got awry. And also because the family members that left that caregiver to that patient were not around. Like they were just hoping that the caregiver could just basically take care of the bulk.
Mhm.
They didn't want to have them in a assisted living facility, but they wanted to do something to still keep them here and still feel like there's a way to turn around the effects of dementia, that maybe there's some way to find certain treatments to, enhance cognitive function, something to bring them back to where they were.
Mhm.
Because that's the
Yes.
part that what I want to get is just a little bit of take of that difference between when someone is bedridden and the level of care that you have to work on. For the most part, what is the most common form of care that caregivers have to be prepared for, that you hear about and you talk about the most?
So as Sue's talking about, we see a lot of family caregivers managing for the first few years of dementia, where family members are able to even maintain their jobs and just support the person living with dementia and support their independence as best they can. Lots of people put cameras or things in their house so they can keep an eye on things and often they'll tell the person living with dementia that this is a way that we can help you maintain your independence. So, you can stay here by yourself a little bit longer, even if the person's going off to work. So for the first few years, you can usually live, you can just support the person, but somewhere in the middle, Sue coined it. I just have absolutely adopted it, called the messy middle. It's when you stop supporting the person living with dementia and you have to assert control over what they're doing. And unfortunately, that's when the person living with dementia thinks they still know how to make decisions and that they don't. And so you have to take over really so much of their day-to-day living because they can't do it themselves. And they're not focused. They're very frustrated because they still want to do it themselves, even though they can't. And you're frustrated because lots of times you want them to still be able to do it themselves. But at that point, something has to give. They can't be by themselves anymore. And either a family member has to stop working and be at home all the time, or you have to hire somebody to come in and support the person living with dementia. They can't be by themselves. And these days, there's more and more people who are trained, caregivers specifically trained in dementia support. So I would suggest if you can find someone that's got at least some level of training for dementia support, that would be a positive. But in the messy middle, it can get really, really tricky because people living with dementia get frustrated, they get angry, they get aggressive because they're scared, because they don't know what's happening. They don't understand why they don't know what's going on. They often find that they're confused. They don't know where they are. They don't know who you are. They're petrified. And so they get aggressive and angry. And that it's very difficult to get through that process, either as a caregiver or a family member. It takes a lot of extra beyond you can even imagine patience and really education, because I think you build confidence when you know what to expect, which is part of why we have our podcast, is to help people build confidence so they know what to expect, so that it's not so scary as the caregiver to know how to handle these different situations.
Right. So now, both of you collectively, you live in Georgia and Florida, so warm weather climates. And I know it's for a lot of us that maybe it's just me that looks at it and perceives it this way, but a lot of the best healthcare we've always heard from Florida or Arizona, from warm weather climates. And if you have a patient that is for dementia or Alzheimer's, and you're not in an area where it's a warm weather climate, for whatever reason, it's always been a thought where I guess sunlight's the best disinfectant. And then the same thing goes for recovery. There's various treatments that always feel like the best healthcare comes from an area where you have these kind of climates. Do you ever notice there's a difference where if you're looking for a good caregiver, it is best to try to look if you can, I don't know if you can relocate or if you could do something where you find some way to create that kind of climate for, I don't know if that makes sense or not, but the thing is,
I think to your point, one of the things that helps in the stability of, especially with the diagnosis of dementia, when we have a loved one who is beginning their journey, is the familiarity. One of the last things you want to do is to get them out of their routine. Okay. The more that you keep them in a routine, keep them with what they're familiar with, their surroundings, the people who are there around, things like that, the easier it's going to be. what you have when you're bringing in caregivers is that we have a significant decrease in the number of people who are actually a family member. It used to be there was a ratio of about 7-to-1 family caregivers to each individual. Now that we have more and more baby boomers becoming the care receivers, that pool of available family caregivers is down to about 4-to-1, and it's going even farther down to about 3-to-1 in the next few years. We also have, from an employment perspective, which is where you're going to get the professional family caregivers, we have fewer people here in the United States who are going into that as a profession. So we have more and more people who are immigrating from other countries. They're less concerned about where they go to live because this isn't their native country. They're more concerned with where they have an opportunity for employment. So as we look to our pool of available family caregivers, often coming from people who have entered the country in order to be family caregivers,
right?
It's not as much a location thing. So I think you're okay no matter where you live. You want to get your loved one in a routine and then find people. One of the things that's great is there are in many, many communities, there are organizations. One of the ones we work with is an organization called Senior Care Authority, and they have connections with communities and with people who serve as caregivers in the home or in communities. And all different kinds of options. So in your local community, you have access to people who can connect you with that. You don't pay them a fee. The company that caregivers work for or the care community is who pays them a fee. So they are really a great resource no matter where you are in the country to try to support you. Because part of the thing is like, I know I never looked for a caregiver before. I hadn't gone to school for being a caregiver, so I didn't have a class 101 on how to find caregivers. And so we can get support. The other place to get support for that wherever you live is through support groups that are local to your area, and people will give you names and references. So again, I think in the summary of it, it's that you do want to keep your care receiver in their environment as much as possible and find resources that surround them in your area.
And as I was saying, I'm a complete novice on this. I'm happy to say this. I know my thing about podcasting, but when it comes to this here, it's really on the outside looking in. And just saying, from being where I live and noticing how many snowbirds we have here on a regular basis that will flock down this way this time of year as we speak. And I mean, I've gotten a chance to go and look into what various caregivers I've seen that have been on the extreme great side of really people-pleasing, caregiving, compassion, to the other side of just complete neglect. I've seen both sides of that. And, one of the things I do part-time is I'm an Uber driver. And I can't tell you how many times where I go to a doctor's appointment for a patient. And just the other day, it was a lady that was, walker coming out. I don't think it was anything in terms of any dementia or Alzheimer's, just a matter of just more of needing just someone to go and help out because you're much older and can't drive, can't go around. But it's one of those things where just I could tell, like, the treatment of the caregiver was like, they probably don't get paid enough. There are so many people that come in to go into nursing on a regular basis, but they don't opt to go into caregiving. They would rather go into becoming an RN or a nurse practitioner and not opt for home health care or certified nurse's aide.
Right.
Is there anything that you see there where there are obviously a lot of great professionals that would be qualified and easily could go ahead and integrate into doing caregiving, but it is a cost issue. There's not enough being offered in terms of incentive to do that. Is that something that has changed in the last couple of decades as you've been, looking at it yourselves? And is that something that could help out in the process of trying to bring better care to patients at home?
George, the first thing you want to do is look at the level of care you need, because that does affect the cost. So are you just looking for a companion? Sometimes early in the diagnosis, really you just need a companion, someone to support them, like we talked about, and you can leverage technology to help as well. But sometimes you'll bring a companion and you don't want them to get isolated, and that actually accelerates dementia. So you want to make sure they stay as mentally active socially as you can. Send them to adult, let the companion take them to adult day programs like adult daycare, or at least support them with some activities like go out to lunch or, basically be around. To your point, they can cook and clean and do a lot of other stuff, but they're there as much for companionships. That is the least expensive kind of caregiving to get. The second one is what you mentioned, which is a CNA, Certified Nursing Assistant. And that is what you'll probably get as you move into the mid-stage dementia. A Certified Nursing Assistant is someone who is trained in changing incontinence underwear and from there all the way through. And that kind of person is going to cost more. And then the third one is when you need skilled nursing. And that's towards the end. And in skilled nursing, that's a third level of expense. So first you need to identify what level of care you're looking for, depending on where your care receiver is in their diagnosis and in their journey. And that'll help with expenses. Then you have two choices. You can go through a care service, and that will cost more, no question, but they'll do background checks. They'll do, they'll do all sorts of financial checks. They'll pay the taxes. It's an easier way to bring someone in, and they'll make sure if the person can't come to work that day that someone comes in to replace them. So there's something to be said for that. Right. However, a lot of people also, especially in smaller communities, my parents were an hour and a half south of Atlanta. And so in a smaller community, and everyone knows everyone who cares for, my dad had Parkinson's, and everyone knows everyone who cares for the Parkinson's people, right? So as someone would pass away or move into nursing home, that person would free up and someone would pick them up for a few hours to begin to support their family. And so they did it all through private, almost completely down there. And we did a little bit of a care service for nighttime duty, but all through private. It costs less when you do private, but you are responsible if someone can't make it to work. You either need to stay home or you have to find someone else to back them up. So it's a little more complicated, and you have to deal with background checks and being confident this person is capable of supporting your family member. And then the same with skilled nursing. By the time you get to skilled nursing, that's a whole nother level of care. Usually you definitely want to go through a care service for that kind of a person. Those are usually not word of mouth roles when you get to skilled nursing. And if you are going to do it privately, you need, for either one, unless you're rushing, you want to interview the person in an extensive level as best you can. And when you narrow it down to like two people, if particularly we're talking about people with dementia, if you can get it down to a couple of people, then I would have the care receiver be involved in the last couple of interviews if it's a reasonable thing to do, and you can just see how they interact with the person. Right. And then whatever you do, I would do it on a trial basis, because to your point, they may not be a very good caregiver. All of that is good due diligence, but they may not be good at it, and they may not be as loving and sweet and nice as you want them to be. And you know what? I would just make it clear that it's on a trial basis, and I wouldn't be scared to put cameras in my house. I did it. Yeah. We did it at my mother's house. And so when she was away, we had cameras, and I did it at my house. I had a part-time caregiver at my home, and there were cameras all over the house, and I didn't apologize for it because I felt like that was just a checkpoint.
For my grandfather, I know it took us 3 caregivers to find the one that was really going to be set for us, but we had to go through that process. The other thing too is that in consideration for both of you, when you are talking about this on the podcast, I don't think it's even so much about a cost about how much it would cost to just be private or go to assisted living. I just don't like it. I don't have a good feeling about assisted living. I did do a tour as a favor to someone to go ahead and ask, because they were saying, well, we're looking to get their grandmother to go ahead, or their mother to be brought into this facility. So I did the tour for them. It might have been a nice facility. Everybody might have been very gracious and kind, and really it was like a nice place. I just can't see it. I mean, if it was for my parents, I wouldn't want them in assisted living. I would not want to do it.
Let me speak to that first, and then I'll let Sue speak to it. My mother is 86. My father passed away. He had Parkinson's for 25 years. We had kept him at home, private caregivers and everything. He moved, when he passed last January, we moved her into independent living in a care community. She is having the time of her life. Wow. I am telling you, she has a better social life than I do ×2. So I didn't feel much different than you, actually. Okay. But I am completely turned around. As a matter of fact, when I'm 86, I have every intention, if I have all my mental faculties, to be in a care community like she's in, because she is having a ball. So I think the social interaction is not to be estimated, depending on the person. And Sue has experience with a family member that socially it was best to keep them at home, and family members where socially it was best to give them the stimulation of a community.
Right. It really is an individual choice. It's something specific for everyone. And what you want to get really clear on is, what are the ultimate goals of this relationship, and what's the right kind of community for your loved one. And with my dad was a very private person, and the care community was not a great community for him. He was uncomfortable being around a lot of the other people. He was very private about a lot of things. And it wasn't the kind of a community. When he got farther along in his diagnosis, it wasn't as big of an issue because he was no longer connected with it. So some of it is timing. A big part of it is that as for the care, and I'll talk about my husband in just a moment, but we know our loved one well. We know what their triggers are. We know what the things they want to do. We understand what about safety is. So we pre-look. I went to a variety of care communities in selecting one for my husband, who was very social. And I could not at home give him the amount of social stimulation that was the right thing for him where he was with his diagnosis. And so what I did is I looked at care communities, not for what was on the walls, not for who was leading the care community, those things that could change, but what were their models? What were their models of care, and what were the components of how they supported their loved ones? And then I looked for ones that had a day program that I could take my husband to, where he could do a trial run, where he could practice with it. And we went through a couple where the outcome was not what we would have anticipated. And we got to the third one. And after the first day of the date, when I picked him up after the first day, I said, well, how are you doing, hon? And he was as happy as he could be. Now, he didn't remember at all what he had done, but he was happy and he felt good. And I went back several times with him. They had a lot of activities. They had music. They were engaged with people. And it was the right kind of a place for him. So it's a very, very personal decision. The other reason that I chose, and I think this is a very important point to make sure everybody understands, part of the reason it was important for me to find a care community for my husband, he was a larger gentleman than I am. When he went into what I call dementia moments, and he didn't know where he was, and he didn't know who I was, and he was frightened, I wasn't always sure, nor was he, and there were examples of this, that I could stay safe or he could stay safe.
Yeah.
So there are different reasons to consider a care community, and your safety is absolutely one of the primary things. My husband in his normal faculties would never have laid a hand on me or done anything. But when he's in a dementia moment, that's a whole different person. And when we have dementia diagnoses, and I can't speak for other diagnoses, but all the rest of it is pretty much the same kind of a thing you would do. But with a dementia diagnosis where they don't have control, that's something that's very important. It's as important for you as it is for them when you're finding what the right choice is.
And I'll add one more thing, and just to finish us. Sue and I just did a podcast on this. Is it time to change your loved one's living situation, home, and community, that goes through a checklist of think about it this way, think about it this way, think about that. Here's the checklist for you to go through to decide what's right for your loved one. So all of my care receivers stayed at home. Sue had one stay at home and two went into care communities. So we have the experience to say, look, here's what you think through. But what's interesting is, even for mine who stayed at home, I had already picked out care communities. So if the time came where I needed to make a move, I knew where we were going, and I'd already gotten on the wait list. And so I knew that I was prepared to transition, to make that leap at any moment if there needed to be a change. So you don't want to get caught flat-footed thinking you're always going to keep the person at home, and then all of a sudden something changes, especially people living with dementia, things change. And now all of a sudden you're desperate for finding one versus being able to actually have gone through due diligence and thought it all the way through.
So a couple more questions before we wrap things up. One is, I want to just unpack the fact that I really love the answer you gave when it comes to considering home and community living options, because I really, from the outside looking in, if I would have heard that on your podcast and understand that, that
Mhm.
really helps to make clarity. For me, I love what you do have right now. I feel like this is just a reference guide. There's so
Mhm.
much you give here, and really, also even just the fact you do twice a month. It's not like you're overwhelming people with a lot of content. It's just a matter of great content. You're getting on great people here, and one of the areas you've been talking about as well in the last couple episodes is in the life. And
Mhm. Yes.
oh man, that's when I think of that, I mean, I know my mother passed away 3 years ago, and coming up on 3 years. And just knowing, but it was a heart issue. It was not anything in terms of dementia or Alzheimer's, but I've had family members that have gone through that. We had to deal with it. We knew it was eventual. That's what a tough subject to go ahead and bring up front. And you brought hospice nurses together, and you had that point where, the time ticks. I just want to go and get in how you felt about when you did talk to those hospice nurses, when you talked about planning the funeral service, all those areas that people were just, of course, we all have to be prepared for it. When we know that the caregiving can only last for so long, but then we have to get to this point of, okay, it's time to say goodbye, and we have to do the proper measures. Talk to me about those episodes you've been doing about that.
Right. One of the things that has made it easier for me throughout all of my journeys, and it's continued to become easier for me, especially with the last journeys with my dad and with my husband, are that I got to the place of acceptance. I accepted this is the journey. This is exactly what the journey is. I accepted it 100%. And I accepted it. I didn't have to like it. I didn't have to agree with it. I didn't have to understand it. I just had to accept, okay, this is what we have, and accept it without judgment of the disease, of myself, or anyone else. And when I got to that place of acceptance, it was easier for me to stay really fully present in the moment of exactly what was going on. So I could make the wisest choices, some of which were very challenging kinds of choices to make. And what this is, when we are in those times, we recognize that all of us are going to come to the end of our lives. The things that we talk about doing for our loved ones are things that we should be looking at also for ourselves. So in the context of with our loved one, it is, if we can have the conversations with them early in the diagnosis while they're still able to participate in the choices, that's really a good thing to be able to do, because then we know more about what they're choosing. If that hasn't had the opportunity to happen, we're their advocate. And so the more effectively we can do it, and we actually had kind of a trifecta. We talked with elder law attorneys about the legal sides of things. We talked with hospice about when and how to bring hospice in. And one of the reasons we wanted to make sure that we responsibly talked about hospice, so many people have a misunderstanding about what hospice is. So our podcast episode on hospice clarified what hospice is so that you can responsibly use the services of hospice at the appropriate times with your loved one. And it's not always in those last 5 days. My husband's journey was over 2 years with hospice. And then the other part of that, where it's the funeral planning and end of life, and the components of that are so that you really get down to what the gentleman, Greg Cannon, said is, okay, what we don't know is the date they're going to pass away. We don't know that, but everything else can be done. And when all of those things are done, and we are able with hospice care to be with our loved one, and we know that they're not suffering, and we can be transitioning, then all of those things have the opportunity for us to have more peace of mind. And we've talked to elder law attorneys, so we know everything legally is taken care of. Then we are able to concentrate just with our loved one. And we wanted other people to have the opportunity for that, because while both Nancy and I did that, we know people who didn't, and the outcome was not very positive.
Sue, I must admit, the fact it was with your husband, and that taking that vow when to marry him to be with him through sickness and then health has to be a test on you. But that's also just, it really shows your complete unconditional love for him, no matter how this comes across. And I feel for you about how you had to go through that. And I don't know if that's continuing on still, if he's still with us and all, but I don't even know how I can say about that. That's amazing.
One of the things I will say is we celebrated what I say is his birthday back into heaven.
Yeah.
And I was able to be completely at peace with that part of our journey.
Yeah. No regrets. No regrets at all.
Nope.
I'm emotional already. Wow. This is a lot. And it's one of those, this is a necessary podcast. I totally agree with that. And I love that you were able to go ahead and put yourselves together to do this in the first place and to tackle this issue because it's so important. And if we're not dealing with someone that is an Alzheimer or dementia patient, we know somebody that is.
That's the truth.
So the thing is, that's the power of podcasting, because it would be so hard to try to get this as a radio program or to get out there to mainstream media to go and discuss this, because they don't. I mean, the last time I remember seeing a good documentary about this, I remember about 15 years ago, I think it was HBO had a really strong documentary. I remember on one of our networks that I worked for full time, we had the producer of the Alzheimer's, his name was John Hoffman, I think it was. I forget the name. It's been a long time. But I'm trying to think about the fact of when's the last time I really saw any stories or anything that was really focused on this. But as a podcast, this absolutely works. And I'm glad that you both decided to go ahead and take this journey here and start this. So you're already 30 plus episodes in, and talk to me about the feedback of the audience. What's the demographic you've had so far, and what kind of commentary? I'm sure you must have had some amazing commentary so far about what he's talked about so far.
Our demographics is actually an interesting play. We've got over 12,000 subscribers and we're about 8 months in. And the demographic is about 40% US, 60% outside the US. Huge following in South Africa, the Philippines, UK, Canada.
Wow.
Obviously a large following in the US as well, because the numbers are there, but there's a big hole for practical tips. There's a lot of high level information out there, but people are starving for what do I do in this situation? So like I said before, we try to keep our episodes to 25 minutes because we want to make sure it's here's the situation, bathing and dressing. Here's what you can expect first. Here's how to handle this. Tip 2 is this, tip 3 is this, tip 4 is that. They're very, direct, and we tell stories about why this is a good way to do it or why we did it the wrong way, and this is how we learned not to do it again.
Yes.
So demographically, it's been a big, that was a big eye-opener for Sue and I. We both wanted this to be a global podcast. We just didn't realize from day one how much of an impact it was going to make globally right off the bat. That was a big surprise. And then the comments are endearing. They are the comments. If we write down what our objective is with this podcast, which is to give dementia family caregivers confidence, patience, and peace of mind, the comments are, you made me feel like I can do it. I now understand about incontinence, and I'm thinking about it from their perspective now instead of from mine. And so I'm a much nicer caregiver because of it. You give me the confidence that this is something that I can handle. And time again, that's the comment that we get. And and I'll pass them to Sue, or Sue will pass them to me when we see them. And I'm like, this is exactly why we're doing this. So They hit the nail on the head. Almost every comment does.
Yeah. Also, and it's what brings us back. Yeah. It's we're so passionate, both of us. We created what we're doing as a nonprofit because our passion is to be serving those who are the family caregivers. And we're so passionate about it. And when we get these messages, what they're identifying for us is that we are on the right track, that the things we struggled with, which was trying to find answers and trying to find the details. And that's why we're so specific on focusing on those. And that's what people are saying. Thank you. You're bringing us what we didn't have. You're giving us the answers we didn't know. And that's why we structured ourselves the way we did. And that's why we pick the topics that we do. That's why we bring in other experts. And then we also take a long time working with each one of them before we do the podcast episode so that we put them in the best position to give the most amount of detailed quality information for our audience, and that we're asking the questions our audience needs the answers to.
Thank you for the service. Thank you for putting this. I don't know if you, and the thing is interesting about the audience demographic, about how many areas you would have that, that culturally they're very much extended families. A lot of loved ones that just everybody stays together, cousins, uncles, aunts, everybody's just so close knit, and they find a way to take care of their loved ones. And I also love the fact you're able to go ahead and expand on the fact that you can find favorable experiences, whether it's taking care of a loved one at home or at a assisted living facility, however that works. And that's wonderful. And also just doing whatever it is to best accommodate and make the last couple of years of that person's life as best as possible. And that's real love. And I love that you're doing that. And I love that you're doing this podcast. So really, I think a lot of people are going to say the same thing. Thank you for doing this. Because I don't know who else can do it. This is not like the first, imagine it's the first topic people want to go and talk about, but this is a necessity.
Well, thank you for helping us get the word out, because that's really, it's no good if people don't know about it. So,
right.
So I want to go ahead and take people over to thecaregiversjourney.com, thecaregiversjourney.com. And real quickly, take a minute or two. There's a lot of things besides the podcast. You have online course, you have books, free guides, you have your social media platforms. Take us through what the Caregivers Journey does besides the podcast.
So we do Facebook. We have a Facebook page and group that we interact with that comes from all over the world as well. Instagram, LinkedIn support, and then on the website itself, we have podcasts, usually around 25 minutes. Every podcast has a matching blog. That's usually a couple of pages. So if you want to read about the topic and quickly get the information, you can do it through the blog. It's really an alignment with the podcast very directly. Sue wrote a caregiving book that before we even hooked up for this podcast several years ago. It's fantastic. You can find that book on the podcast on the website as well. We have, as you know, worksheets, guides, ebooks. There's an e-learning course. So we're trying, and then we're getting ready to add, hopefully just in the next couple of weeks, a resource page, because we are investigating other resources that are not developed by us. I went to a recent dementia caregiver course that I took online for 8 hours to see if this is a good resource for our listeners. So that kind of thing will also be online on our resources page, so that we can connect people with good resources that we can confidently say we've used or listened or participated in. We're not just randomly putting resources out there. These are ones we can confidently recommend to our listeners.
Also, I would recommend when you go to the website, there's a big blue donate button right there. Non-for-profit. Make sure to go and help out these folks. And really, Nancy and Sue, I appreciate you bringing this forward to us. And I'm glad I got a chance to go and talk about this in the program. This is tough for me to talk about, because like I said, I'm just thinking about things when it comes to my family and knowing what I've seen firsthand. And I think you've really you kind of opened my eyes to a lot of different things. And I need that. So I hope other people will latch on, subscribe to your podcast. It's all on all major podcast platforms, but all emanates from the caregiversjourney.com. And again, Nancy, Treaster, Sue Ryan, thank you so much for being on with us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Absolutely. Definitely. And folks, that's another podcaster show. Really appreciate you taking time to go and join us, and come back. We'll have another episode for you next time.